Hi guys, welcome back. It is time for probably my favorite video of the year, my yearly reading stats video. In this video, we're going to talk about all of my reading stats for 2019. Like I said, this is definitely one of my favorite videos to make every year. I love watching stats videos. I love making stats videos. So if you're ready to geek out with me and look at all of the stats that I've been keeping track of in my crazy spreadsheet all year, stick around. In 2019, I read 304 books. This is slightly more than 2018 when I read 300 books, so staying pretty similar. This was for a total of 110,917 pages, which means that the average page length of books that I picked up this year was 365 pages. First up, let's take a look at how many books I've been reading every month for the year. It's also kind of interesting to look at this next to how many books I've been reading for every month in the last 2 years that I have the data for this. I started my BookTube channel in June of 2017, and as you can see, the amount that I've been reading since then has continued to increase. Part of this is that in early 2017, I still had a newborn. That took up a lot of my time. And I think part of this has been the introduction of audiobooks in the second half of 2018, and that has become a really significant chunk of my reading, as you will see. 2019, my highest reading month in terms of number of books read was January with 33, and my lowest months were September and December with 20. December this year was a really busy month for me, so that shouldn't be too surprising. And my average books read per month has jumped up from last year. Last year, my average was 24.9 books per month. This year, it's 25.3, so slightly higher, but not a lot higher. So in general, it definitely seems like I'm finding a good pace that works for me, and I think this is probably what it's going to continue to look like. Looking at the age category breakdown, this is actually really interesting. My goal for 2019 was to have closer to a 50-50 split between YA and adult audience books with a few middle grade books sprinkled in for good measure. Last year, I read 40% adult, 52% YA, and the rest was middle grade. Whereas this year, I read 48.5% adults, 46% YA, and 5.5% middle grade. So I'm really happy with that. This year I actually read more adult than I did YA, which feels kind of accurate to me. I feel like especially with romance becoming a bigger part of my reading and just kind of the direction my tastes have been taking me. I still love YA, but I wouldn't be surprised in 2020 if this percentage continued to increase a little bit, where I'm seeing more of the disparity on the adult side rather than the YA side, and that is definitely a change over the last couple of years, so that's kind of interesting. In terms of the format that I'm reading in, audiobooks in 2019 have become a huge part of my reading. Sometimes, depending on the book, I will actually listen to an audiobook and physically read it at the same time. It can help me like increase my pace of reading slightly and comprehension depending on the type of book it is. But really, the audiobooks are just so helpful for me because I can listen to them while I'm doing chores and running errands, while I'm at the playground with my kids, while I'm doing other things. And because my comprehension level with them tends to be pretty high, that has ended up becoming a really huge part of how I'm getting books read this year. One thing to know is that I only started listening to audiobooks halfway through 2018. So for 2019, I expected to see a significant jump in the percent of books that I was reading via audio format, although I will say this jump may be even higher than I expected, but I'm kind of okay with that. So in 2018, 12.5% of the books that I read were audiobooks. In 2019, 42.6% of the books that I read I listened to via audio format. Some of them physically reading while listening, but still, that's a pretty significant number. It's not quite 50%, but that is a big chunk of my reading. So for those of you who wonder how I read as much as I do, that's a big part of it. I integrate audiobooks into my life pretty regularly. In addition to that, 30.7% of the books that I read this year were uncorrected proofs. Some of these were physical, some of these were digital. I didn't separate them out in this category, but I will talk about in general how many things I read that were physical versus digital. I definitely think that in general, the number of books that I'm reading for review has gone up significantly. I'm getting more things sent to me, I'm reading more things for review, and I think I have that number here somewhere. Where did I put that? Yeah, so this year, out of the 304 books that I read, 153 of them were books that I was sent for review in one way or another. That is 50.3%. So about half of my reading in 2019 was books for review. So this includes NetGalley, this includes books from BookCon, books sent to me by the publisher or by PR companies, etc. So, but that's a lot. I'm doing a lot of reviewing. Some of these are backlist titles that I had ARCs for from like 2018, but the majority of these are 2019 releases. I read a lot of 2019 releases and a lot of them were for review. In terms of the other formats that I was reading in, this year about 8.5% of the books that I read were hardcovers, 7.9% were trade paperbacks, 3.6% were graphic novels, 3% were mass market paperbacks, 3% were ebooks, and 0.7% were manga. One note on the ebooks, the reason that this is so low is that most of the ebooks I read are uncorrected proofs or EARCs, and that number gets jumbled into the overall uncorrected proof category. So while I actually have read a lot of books using my e-reader this year, most of them were ARCs and were not just books that I purchased. In terms of my overall reading, 58.9% of my reading in 2019 was digital and 41.1% was physical. So yeah, that digital is including all of my audiobooks and all of my e-ARCs and ebooks that I read. A lot of it is digital, a lot of this is on the go, and I think this is indicative of the fact that my life this year has been a lot busier. My younger son is getting older, he's not napping as long, which means that more of the reading that I'm doing is on the go with him, not sitting on the couch while he naps for 3 hours. Like, now I'm lucky if like every other day he naps for an hour and a half and I get a moment to like answer some emails. So I think that that's part of where that number is coming from. While we're on the subject, let's talk a little bit more about my audiobooks and the breakdown of them. In 2019, 129 of the books that I read, I listened to via an audio format, which, like I said, is 42.6% of the books that I consumed in 2019. And of those audiobooks, 95 of them were what I term shelf, which means that they were audio versions of books that already existed on my TBR shelf. Some of these are backlist titles, some of these were ARCs that I hadn't gotten to, or ARCs that were current that I had physically but listened to via audio to get them off my TBR shelf, and that is a total of 73.5% of the audiobooks I listened to were addressing things that were on my physical TBR shelf. In terms of where those audiobooks were coming from, the vast majority of them were coming from my library via the Overdrive app. 81 of the audiobooks I listened to in 2019 were from my library, so I make really, really good use of that. The next largest location for my audiobooks is Scribd. 28 of the audiobooks I listened to this year were from Scribd, which I think is pretty good. That works out to what? That works out to an average of a little more than 2 a month, which I think definitely would pay for the cost of the membership at $8.99 a month. I think that's pretty good. 10 of the books that I listened to this year were from Audible. Late in the year, I did restart my Audible membership. I was given a pretty good deal for 3 months where I got a discount, and it has been something that I'm finding really useful because audiobooks are such a big part of my reading now. 9 of the audiobooks I listen to are from the Penguin Random House Volumes app as audio review copies. I am a reviewer for them, and so I have access to downloading review copies of audiobooks through them. So 9 of the audiobooks this year were from that. And then just in December, the newest thing that I'm adding, which you'll probably be seeing more of in 2020, is Libro FM. I recently signed up to be an influencer with Libro FM, which means I'm also getting access to review audio copies through them now. And I did listen to 1 audiobook from them. If you're not familiar with them, they're a pretty great program. It's an app where people can purchase audiobooks and support indie bookstores. The proceeds of it go back to supporting indies, which I think is really great. So one of my audiobooks for the year came from them. Again, that number is probably going to go up in 2020. Okay, so we talked about the format of the books that I've been reading. Next, let's talk about the type of books that I have been reading in 2019. The vast majority of the books that I'm reading are, in fact, novels, and this probably shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. 84.9% of the books that I read in 2019 were novels, 6.9% were graphic novels, 4.9% were novellas, 2.3% were anthologies, and 0.7% were manga. Next, let's talk about the genre of the books I've been reading. And this I think is pretty interesting. One thing that has stayed pretty steady from last year to this year is the percentage of my reading that is coming from science fiction and fantasy. Last year, the total percentages, if you added fantasy and sci-fi together, was 46%. This year, it's slightly higher at 47%. However, fantasy is taking up a larger chunk of that. Last year, I think my sci-fi was a little over 10%. This year, it is at 9.2%, whereas fantasy is 37.8%. So at nearly 40% of my reading, fantasy is definitely my genre of choice. I don't think this should come as a huge shock to anybody. Every month, I feel like, almost every month, fantasy is way more what I'm reading than anything else, and I do really love it. What has changed from last year, which is interesting, is that I'm reading more romance. And again, I don't think this is super surprising. In 2018, 8% of the books that I read were romances, and in 2019, that jumped to 16.4%. So that's a pretty significant jump. Romance is definitely becoming a more significant part of my reading diet. Moving on from there, the third largest category in terms of genre for this year was contemporary fiction at 11.2%. Then we had sci-fi at 9.2%. Nonfiction came in at 5.9%, which is fine. Historical fiction at 3.6%, thrillers at 3%, superhero books at 2.6%, paranormal at 2.3%, mystery at 2.3%, and literary fiction at 2%. Poetry did not even make the graph. It's like one of those tiny little slivers, so it's probably less than a percentage point, so not much there. In terms of publication year, it should come as no surprise given how many books I've been reading for review that definitely the largest chunk of my reading was from 2019. 167 of the books that I read were published in 2019 for a total of 55%. A lot of these were probably books that I had for review, but not entirely. Some of them were just books that I was interested in picking up. I also read 6 2020 releases before the end of the year. I do try to mostly save my 2020 releases until later on, but I read a few and a lot of really good ones, which I'm excited about. I also read quite a number of books that were published in 2018. 58 of the books that I read this year were published in 2018, and then 73 of the books that I read were published prior to 2018 as true backlist titles. And the earliest publication date for books that I read in 2019 was Kindred by Octavia Butler. This one was published in 1979, so clearly I've also not read a whole lot of classics this year. It would be nice to maybe see that change a little bit in 2020, try to pick up one or two and see if I can find ways to slap those in. All right, next up, let's talk about the location of where I was getting the books that I was reading this year. Again, I know not everybody is into stats like this, but I just find it really fascinating, and we are going to get into some other things about my ratings and the diversity of what I read and my most read authors, but first we're going to talk about a few other things. So in terms of location, definitely the biggest place that I was getting books was from my library. 29.4% of the books that I read this year were from my library, and almost all of those were probably audiobooks. I am taking heavy advantage of my library in that way. 14.2% of the books that I read this year were books that I received from a publisher directly. 13.5% of the books that I read this year were from NetGalley, so these are my e-arcs. 8.6% were books that I picked up at BookCon or another bookish event. This number is a little bit low because it's not taking into account the audiobooks that I listened to for physical arcs that I had, because sometimes I do that. So this number maybe should be a little bit higher, but in terms of just pure, I read the physical arc that I physically got at those places, it's 8.6%. About 8.5% of the books that I read came from Scribd. 6.3% came from Amazon, which I'm pretty happy with, actually. That's definitely a lower percentage than it's been in previous years. 4.6% of the books that I read came from The Strand, which is my local indie that I go to most often. 4% of the books that I read were sent to me directly from authors. 3.6% were books that I got from Book Outlet. 2% were from other indie bookstores other than The Strand. 2% were sent to me from PR agencies, 1.7% were from friends or family, and 1% were books that I picked up at Barnes & Noble. Okay, and then another thing that I'm tracking this year, although I'm not entirely happy with the way I tracked it on my spreadsheet this year, so I'm changing this up a little bit in 2020, and I'm hoping to get a little more information. But I did somewhat track publisher and where these books were coming from, mostly for the big five and a couple of additional ones. And for next year, I'm going to try to actually include more of the smaller publishers so that they don't just get thrown into this other category, because that's just not very helpful in terms of information. But the publisher that I read from the most this year was Penguin Random House at 21.4%. Next up is HarperCollins at 18.8%. Then there was another 18.8% that is in this other category. So this includes graphic novels, manga, smaller publishers like HMH or Sourcebooks. This does not include indie authors, but Abrams, any of the smaller publishers that aren't among the big five are kind of thrown in that category. So again, for 2020, I'm going to try to break that out a little bit. 13.2% of the books that I read were from Macmillan, and 4.6% were from Tor. Tor is a part of Macmillan, so altogether, 17.8% of the books that I was reading were coming from Macmillan through one of their imprints. 7.6% of the books that I read were from Hachette, 5.9% from Simon & Schuster, 2.3% from Disney Hyperion and other Disney presses, 1% from Bloomsbury, and 5.3% from indie authors. That said, let's talk a little bit about diversity. And I think this year I did a bit of a better job tracking the diversity of the books that I was reading in multiple different categories, which we're going to talk about. First up, let's talk about author country. One thing that I struggle with in how to say which country the author is from is that some of the authors I read are originally from other countries but currently reside in the United States or in the UK. This is true of actually a lot of authors. There's quite a number of immigrant authors, and so for 2020 I might want to try to find a way to make that an additional category, like immigrant in the US, immigrant in the UK, just to give me a little bit more information. But for now, if they currently live in the US, they're included under the US. So for 2019, 81.6% of the books that I read were from US-based authors, 7.2% were from UK-based authors, 3.3% were from Canadian authors, 2.6% from Australian authors, 1.6% from authors in New Zealand, and then the rest were kind of split up, one or two here and there, from other countries around the world. So obviously the vast majority of the reading that I'm doing is from authors who are living in Western countries. I would like to see a little bit more about some of them who are immigrants to those countries. I think that would be useful information to have, because I know there are quite a number of them that are buried in there, but also this is definitely someplace that I could grow and do a better job of reading more books from other countries. There are some, it's just there were just a few here and there, and so they're not really showing up here very clearly. They're like some of those little slivers. In terms of other types of diversity, in kind of like a big picture aspect of it, 73.6% of the books that I read were diverse in some way. This could be one or multiple ways, and this includes a lot of different things, but 73.6% of the books that I was reading included some form of diversity, which I think is great. That means that only 26.4% of the books that I read were books that I said did not have significant diversity in any way. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what that actually means. This year, 25% of the books that I read had LGBTQIAP+ representation in a significant way. So this would include books where the author was in some way part of that community, books where the main character was part of that community, or books where a significant side character, not a small side character, but a significant side character was part of this. So 25% of the books that I read had some kind of significant LGBT+ representation in it, which I'm very happy with. And at a larger level, 31% of the books that I read were by authors of color. We're gonna get into specific numbers of the breakdown there, but I think that's pretty good. I could see that go higher, but I definitely think that is a jump from last year, which is great. That's something that I really focus on. In 2019, I read 42 books by Black authors, 16 books by Latinx authors, 23 books by East Asian authors, 14 books by authors of either South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, and 1 book by a Native author. In terms of other forms of diversity, I also looked at neurodiversity and disability representation. 6% of the books that I read in 2019 had neurodiverse main characters. I didn't track this super carefully throughout the reading year, so this number may be higher, but going back and looking through the books that I read, these were the ones that I recall where that was definitely the case. And 2% of the books that I read had main characters with a disability. Next, let's look at author gender. So these numbers have stayed pretty similar to last year. The main place that this has changed is that I've read slightly more books by non-binary authors. So unsurprisingly, at least to me, I read majority books by female authors. I do tend to gravitate towards them. This year, 79.3% of the books that I read were written by female authors. 16.1% of the books that I read were written by male authors. 3.6% of the books that I read were written by a co-writing team of male and female authors. This might include anthologies or books that were just co-written by a male author and a female author. And 1% of the books that I read this year were by non-binary folks. This is up from 0.3% last year, so we're getting somewhere. Next, let's talk about my ratings. So 2019 was the first year that I introduced a 6-star rating into my rating system, where a 6-star represents a book that is either a favorite of the year or a favorite of all time. This was really, really helpful for me in terms of parsing which books are true favorites and which books were just really good that I think deserve 5 stars, given the way that I give out 5 stars, which is exactly the same as what it was last year. I am fine with that. And in terms of percentages, let's look at the different star rating breakdowns. This year, 1% of the books that I read got 1 star. 0.7% of the books that I read got 1.5 stars. I don't give those out very frequently. Like, they have to be pretty terrible books for me to give out 1 star or 1.5 star. Then 4.3% of the books that I read, I gave 2 stars. 3.3% of the books that I read, I gave 2.5 stars. 9.5% of the books that I read got 3 stars. 8.6% got 3.5 stars. Then 26.3% of the books that I read got 4 stars. This is definitely the largest in the categories of ratings that I have given out, although 5 stars is not far behind. I definitely tend to give out higher ratings in general. 14.1% of the books that I read, I gave 4.5 stars, and 25.7% of the books that I read, I gave 5 stars. Like I said, I probably am more generous with my ratings than some other reviewers are. A book doesn't have to be perfect or be an all-time favorite for me to give it 5 stars, so about a quarter of the books that I read I gave 5 stars this year. However, for a book to get 6 stars, which means it is a favorite of the year, a favorite of all time, my standards are much higher, and only 6.6% of the books that I read this year got 6 stars for me. So that is definitely a much smaller category. One thing that I do want to say about these percentages though is that this year I was also much more willing to DNF books if I wasn't enjoying them, and I don't rate books that I DNF, so that might be part of why my ratings are skewing higher as well. In 2019 I DNF'd 28 books. And like I said, I did not give ratings out to any of those. That is a pretty significant number, and all of them probably would have been on the lower end of this scale, so do keep that in mind when you're considering the percentages. Okay, and the last thing that I want to talk about in my stats video for the year is my most read authors. This is so interesting to me because last year I had some really clear most read authors where I had read a lot of books from a couple of authors. This year it was not so much that way. The top category of my most read authors is people that I read 4 of their books in 2019, and there were 3 authors that I did this with. They are Anne Bishop, because I was finishing up her Written and Read Others series, Marie Rutkowski, because I read the entire Winter's Curse trilogy, and I read my arc of The Midnight Lie, which is her 2020 release, and Martha Wells, because I read all of the Murderbot novellas. So those are 3 authors that I read 4 books from each of them. Then there are 6 authors where I read 3 of their books this year. Those are Alyssa Cole, Katie O'Neill, Sarah Morgan, Morgan Rhodes. This is because I was finishing up her series so that I could do a full review of the Fallen Kingdom series, so I read 3 of those books at the beginning of the year. and then Talia Hibbert and Tessa Dare. So what's interesting to me looking at the people that I read 3 books each from them is that one of them writes graphic novels. Katie O'Neill, I read 3 of her middle grade graphic novels this year. Morgan Rhodes wrote the Fallen Kingdom series, so that was for a specific review project that I was finishing up. And then the other 4 people are all romance authors and ones that I really like a lot, and read 3 books each from them. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. I didn't do as much binging a specific author this year as I may have in other years. It was much more spread out. Man, okay, so that is it, guys. Those are my stats for 2019. I find this stuff to be super interesting. Hopefully you guys do as well, and this wasn't like too boring, and hopefully you enjoy the nice graphs and pictures. In general, I would say I'm pretty happy with how my reading for the year turned out. I think I'm doing a pretty good job of doing the things that I care about in terms of reading diversely. It is interesting to see the audiobooks are taking up such a big percentage of my reading this year. But yeah, I find this really fascinating. Talk to me in the comments down below if you made it all the way to the end of this video. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on the things that I talked about. And for your question of the day, tell me something about what you track in terms of your reading for the year. Do you track any of your statistics? Some of them, a lot of them? I am totally a spreadsheet nerd, so I love having my super in-depth spreadsheet where I can track all of this stuff and talk about it at the end of the year. It's really fun for me, but some people that's super overwhelming and not up their alley. So let me know how you tend to approach dealing with your stats. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.